Trill system, mid-2669, MFP 1404-9904, Razor, F7A Super Saber. After the success and conquer of the Verbis system, the 7th Fleet made their way to the next system. It was logged in their archives, and all ships present had their star maps updated with the information taken from the Cellians. Razor had now found himself in the latest brief prior to exiting slipspace, along with other fellow pilots. "All right, listen up, you pansies," the man before them stated, as a round table in the center of the room lit up with several orbs of light and differently colored objects that were then identified as stations or satellites. "We'll be exiting slipspace soon, so here's the rundown. Squadron 111 will have the support of Strike Group Alpha frigates to take out their communications, and Squadron 416. Before he could continue, Razor had already begun to tune out most of the fluff and excess detail that he felt wasn't necessary, leaving him only with his thoughts. Razor sat in the midsection of the circular-shaped seating arrangement as the officer conducted the strategy meeting, which most likely came down from the vice admiral of their battle group. The room was large enough to fit a couple hundred people, as was the case here, but even with the number of personnel present, it still didn't reflect the actual number of pilots who were required to attend. Many out on patrol or aboard other ships beside the carrier watched via hologram or datapad. Their mission was simple. Trill was a system that was heavy on industrialization with fuel processing. In fact, it was fuel as the main export of the system, and upon investigation of the types of fuel they utilized, it was hydrogen-based, similar to what the Terrans used in their ships. However, it was later discovered that their mixture for the fuel had better purity and efficiency. "Then, Minerva, do you have any word to pass?" Razor came to from his thoughts, and a transparent figure stood on the table that stood at around 12 inches. "Yes, as you are now aware, Trill system is plentiful in fuel production, with Cellian-produced fuel that exceeds our own by a large margin. Your tasks will be to secure the airspace of these stations for a raider or marine squad to take the station. That is the essence of your mission." She gave a bow and dissipated while the officer retook charge of the brief. "You have your orders. Get to your ships and set for an alert launch." The pilots departed the ready room and made their way to their ships. Many were already in their gear, and most decided to wait beside their ships for pre-flight checks and functionality. With only an hour left of slipspace, he found it best to wait beside his ship, along with the other pilots. So Razor made his way to his ship and sat by a bench on the closest bulkhead to his ship. Razor, like many pilots in the Stellar Fleet, had their names overtaken by a serialization upon entering cadet training. There are several designations of pilots followed by a string of personal identification numbers unique to the individual, with their designation based on their ship class ranging from light, medium, then heavy. Razor examined a dog tag around his neck, and instead of his name, it was stamped MFP 1404-9904, and below it was his nickname, Razor. His blood type was the only other information present of the only 3 details of his identification tags. Razor was designated as a medium fighter pilot, and he piloted the latest in technology with the F7 Super Saber, Alpha variant. It had guns to boast, and its speed was above average. It was recently equipped with a pair of disruptors that were designed to short-circuit shields. Paired with that were a dual set of ballistic repeaters and a single slow-firing cannon. There were also a series of missile racks that allowed 4 total missiles with 8 smaller missiles in a hidden missile bay. It was armed to the teeth and was ready to bear its fangs. As he was mentally preparing for the fight ahead, Razor was approached by 2 of his fellow squad members, Torch and Gearbox. "Your shit all prepped, Razor?" Torch called out. His helmet was gray with a depiction of fire on the face of the helmet that lead to the rear. "Yeah, I'm pinned in, and my racks are inventoried. You?" Razor replied as maintenance personnel inspected his ship for discrepancies, as was standard practice before takeoff. "Better than ever. We just spent the last 20 minutes trying to troubleshoot Gearbox's missile racks. Damn things wouldn't load," said Torch with a shrug. But we got it fixed. Had to give it some love," Gearbox added, nudging Torch, and delivered a wink. The three shared mild conversation when the alarm finally came that they were less than 20 minutes from exiting slip space, and all three returned to their ships. They were all part of Squadron 416 and were each other's wingmen. They got in their cockpit and promptly readied their ships to idle status as the countdown was announced. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. On the launch deck, several hundred fighters began their sequence to launch. The hum of engines rang throughout the deck as interceptors and heavy fighters readied themselves on the catapults to be the first to engage the enemy. The alarm sounded, and the announcement to launch all alert aircraft was relayed. In a systematic manner, the ships departed in their formations. While they departed to their mission areas, Razor and his squadron set out for the fuel processing station over the main planet Trillo. Information from the carrier, Sword of Reckoning, was relayed and updated their IFF information. As a result, a series of blips shown in red popped up around the station and friendlies were shown in green. The squadrons flew in formations of 3, with Razor flanked by Torch and Gearbox in a triangle formation. "This is Control, comms check," said the voice, and all ships accounted for their formations and all were present. 416, secure the airspace around the station and maintain superiority. "Copy," sounded the team lead. "All teams engage slipstream to the station. Weapons free." Razor switched to their team's chat, which only consisted of the 3 wingmen. "Engage stream to the station and unlock weapons. You're free to engage once we're out of the short-range jump," Razor ordered. All fighters began their sequence, including the larger ships accompanying them. They had entered through the edge of the system, and they would use their sublight function to travel to their destination, granting them enough time to prep weapon systems and functionality. Unlike capital ships, fighters lacked the capability for a slipspace jump, and were instead outfitted with a slipstream drive, which offered a sublight mode of travel. This did, however, restrict most fighters, and any ship of a similar class, to a single star system. It is only by entering a slipspace rupture of a capital ship that a fighter can utilize interstellar slipspace travel. They had apparently jumped to just outside their scanners, and they were ensured that they had been jammed, so they took it at face value and turned their sole focus to the fight ahead. When jumping with slipstream, fighters were able to get within tens of kilometers of a station, but larger ships of a corvette, and larger, they were limited to just beyond 100 kilometers from any station. This was to prevent any mishaps of unwarranted acceleration and collision with the station. However, cautionary measures could be disregarded with a well-calculated jump, but a jump like that was reserved for slipspace jumps instead of a stream jump. All ships had entered slipstream, and the trip was timed at just around 10 minutes, and the scene from Razor's cockpit always felt surreal. It was like a separate space moving around the craft, and particles of light were generated at the nose of the ship, adhering to the aerodynamics of the craft. It looked like he was breaking the sound barrier in space, but the scene was constant. He checked his systems and did any last-minute checks. Weapons, armed. Missiles, armed. Shields, 100%. Coolant, fuel, stream fuel, all green. He would have enough for the battle, especially if they were going to have support from the frigates and corvettes. Luckily, some of the corvettes were acting as resupply ships for fuel and munitions. Seconds before they exited slipstream, a call came from the leader of Squadron 416. "Attention all teams. Be vigilant and trust your training. We have several more systems after this, so don't die. Target only marked craft. As soon as you exit, weapons free." Roars of acknowledgement came through the radio. As soon as they dropped out of stream space, all fighters engaged full thrust toward the target. Razor cycled his targeting system as blips of the enemy popped on his HUD as he approached closer to the station. The total members of Squadron 416 numbered in the tens, but they weren't the only ones. With some of the other squadrons, they had a total force of around 150. The total enemy force numbered just below 200. The enemy noticed their approach and charted their course for interception. Seconds passed that felt like minutes, but in the next moment, hundreds of shots littered the void. Razor commanded his team with a route that would take them below the main enemy force and targeted the few of the enemies that overextended. A line of rounds from his disruptors pelted the lead ship, and after several shots, their shields were rendered useless. It was a small ship, and he landed several shots of his main cannon into the dorsal side of the ship, and it went up in a fiery explosion. Chaos now reigned, and no semblance of order was present. It was a sphere of chaos, and the fighters fought against every limitation their craft could allow. Lights of tracers littered the space, and smoke plumes from missiles made trails leading to their unfortunate targets that ultimately ended as space debris. Razor assisted Torch, who reported an enemy was on his tail, and he broke off their formation to the left. Razor and Gearbox followed with a loop and met Torch's attacker with a rain of ballistic fire. The process repeated like a tug-of-war. Pilots pushed their frames to the limit, and the sound of cracking could be heard from within their cockpit. And they did advanced maneuvers to counter their enemy. This persisted for several minutes, as their goal was to buy time for their support ships to arrive. There was no presence of larger Celian ships, and when the Terran ships were in range, supported the ships in combat with accurate and effective fire. The addition of the frigates and corvettes helped whittle down the enemy severely. A set of enemy frigates jumped in during the fight and had taken down some of the friendly fighters, but the Terran frigates were quick to engage. Missiles were first to engage the enemy warships, and a shield deflected them. The Terran ships ceased fire and turned their guns toward the enemy as they continued with a lackluster display of broadside fire and point defense. Numerous shots rang out from the frigates, and a magnetically accelerated mass was launched toward the enemy ships. It hit slightly off to the side, but its effect was enough to shatter the shield. The Terran frigate then moved in closer to the enemy and fired a full volley of broadside. The center of the ship was targeted with calculated precision, and a large hole of molten metal vented into the void. The continual fire was sustained, and the enemy ships were defeated. However, in their final efforts, they had managed to dispatch some of the Terran corvettes that offered support for the fighters. Upon their defeat and with the whittling enemy fighters, they turned opposite of the battlefield and began to flee. Razor and his three-man team were chasing the remnants trying to flee the battle. "Razor, do we take them out? I have a lock and their shields are down," Torch reported over the radio. He thought for what seemed like moments, but was really just fractions of a second. Normally, if they were fleeing from battle, they would be let go, but this wasn't a skirmish or a pirate crackdown. They were engaged in war, and their enemy was a combatant that could warn their comrades. Letting them go would jeopardize the attack group. Before he issued his command, a light from the engine of the Celian ship began to glow. "It's about to jump. Missiles won't make it," Gearbox reported. Thoughts ran through his mind as he led his targeting pip. Shields were still down, but were slowly regenerating. He had to act quickly. "Fire on my mark," Razor ordered. He lined his pip and fired a volley of disruptor, repeater, and cannon. A trail of orange flew through the void as it came short, but Razor began to lead it further, and the shots that continued beyond the ship found its mark. A small explosion burst in the contrast of the deep black, but sensors indicated it was still alive. He tried for the trigger, but all that was sounded was a click with no other feedback. Within the time it took for him to disable the ship, Torch fired two of his smaller AIM-30 IR missiles. Moments after Razor's shots made contact, the two missiles found their mark. With no enemy in their vicinity, they returned to the battle group by the station. With a quick scan over a battleground display, there were no red blips visible. They had captured the sector. As they were returning, Torch spoke, alluding to their final kill. "You know what they say about missiles." "What?" replied Gearbox. "It knows where it is because of where it isn't, and it just found the ass end of a Celian." The two shared a laugh so intoxicating that it only made Razor rub his head in frustration. "Please, shut up." Three conducted their patrols around the station as well as the planet after a refuel and resupply. They would continue flying alongside the warships in a sweep across the system. At times they would be engaged with holdouts trying to reorganize, and efforts to have them surrender were met with stark refusal, and as such, they were destroyed. When all was said and done, Razor and his team landed on the carrier in preparation for the next system, Vilo.
After action report. Squadrons 416, 799, and 872 were successful in taking the large fuel processing station of Trillo. Squadrons 111, 509, and 662 were successful in neutralizing their comms relay throughout the system. Sections of the 7th Fleet also conducted a sweep of the system with deep scans, and any enemy forces in hiding were neutralized if they refused to surrender. Athena's Owl drones also conducted searches over facilities and took any information that could be beneficial. As such, we are decoding their process for hydrogen fuel production. The use of Raider and Marine squads were utilized to seize prisoners and any available R&D. Requesting detachments of Orbital Guard for garrison of captured enemy assets. End of report.